Hello and welcome to Wilson Center Now, a production of the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. I'm John Molesky. My guest today is Nina Jankowicz. Nina serves as the Disinformation Fellow with the Wilson Center's Science, Technology, Innovation Program. She's a former Global Fellow with the Kennan Institute and was also a George F. Kennan Fellow and a Fulbright-Clinton Public Policy Fellow with the U.S. Department of State. She joins us to talk about a touchy subject, U.S.-Ukraine relations. Nina, welcome. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me, John.
Your current title is great. It's like, I remember when tech companies first started to have creativity officers or things like that. It's sort of cutting edge, new terminology.
Yeah, Disinformation Fellow. Sometimes I think it should be counter-disinformation.
Right, because are you a source of propaganda? What are you doing?
No, studying disinformation is what we do here at Wilson, yeah.
So I want to talk to you a little bit about the history of relations between the U.S. and Ukraine, but I don't want to bury the lead, so let's start with the current state of affairs. How would you characterize the relationship now?
Tenuous, but I think the Ukrainians are very committed to walking this balance beam that they've been on for the past couple of months, careful to not upset anyone on either side of the political aisle because they depend so much on U.S. support. The United States is the most important international partner for Ukraine, and Ukraine is very keenly aware of that.
And has that been the case since the end of the Soviet Union, or is that just particularly heightened because of the Russian invasion?
I think certainly the United States has been of more importance as Ukraine has moved toward democratic reform. And over the past 5 years, not just because of Russian aggression in the East and the war that's been going on for the past 5 years, but because Ukraine is committed to this path of Euro-Atlantic integration, joining NATO and the EU, the United States has been an important and vocal ally in that fight.
In the United States, when you look at U.S.-Ukraine relations, obviously the focus right now is on the impeachment. What about from the Ukrainian perspective? How do things look from there to here?
Well, I think Ukrainians are aware that this impeachment proceeding is happening, that Ukraine is at the center of it, but they're much more focused on things going on at home, particularly ending the war in the East, in the Donbas, which has claimed 13,000 lives and particularly affects the elderly and very young children who haven't been able to leave that war-torn zone and are living there at the contact line, where there still is shelling going on. There are still casualties on a regular basis, and I think we in the United States forget about that. You know, it's all about this quid pro quo, but really there are lives at stake in Ukraine, and President Zelensky, when he ran his campaign during the spring, that was his #1 promise, to end the war on the Donbas.
I think it probably goes beyond the U.S. Much of the world seems to have forgotten. This has become almost a chronic circumstance.
Yeah.
What does an endgame look like?
Well, President Zelensky has announced that he has endorsed what's called the Steinmeier Formula, and without boring our viewers too much, basically that says that Ukraine will allow the two territories, Luhansk and Donetsk, that have been occupied to have a special status, that Ukraine will regain control of its border, Russia will pull back heavy weaponry and things like that, and Ukraine will hold elections there. Now, the sequence of these events has not yet been determined. There's currently a de-escalation in progress that has met some limited success, although it's going slower than some people might like. And after that de-escalation has happened entirely and sort of a ceasefire has been sustained for some time, then President Zelensky will meet President Putin in the Minsk Format with some of the European leaders and try to actually hammer out a solution to the conflict.
What's the most optimistic timeline for that happening?
Your guess is as good as mine. I think they thought they might be at a summit by now, but again, that de-escalation is going a bit slower. And the Ukrainian side says that's because there is continued shelling and ceasefire violations coming from the Russian or separatist-controlled areas.
And does the U.S. have a direct role in those negotiations, or is it more the indirect, just maintaining military support for Ukraine?
That is a great question. So we do not have a seat at the Minsk negotiations. When all of this broke out, I think the thinking was that this was a European problem. So France and Germany are there, but the United States doesn't have a seat at the table. However, our support for Ukraine, again, through that military aid that has been the object of so much intrigue, as well as aid for democracy reform and things like that, which is actually the larger sum, plus the rhetorical support that the United States offers, I think is one of the most important things for Ukraine as it continues not only pushing back against Russia, but walking that path of democratic reform.
Now, the situation would be sensitive for a veteran leader, and yet we have a rookie president in Ukraine who also is a political novice. How is he handling the situation?
Well, I think the jury is still out. He's done a lot of good things in Ukraine so far. He's moved along with a lot of the anti-corruption reform that President Poroshenko, his predecessor, couldn't seem to get done, including allowing the president to be impeached, for instance. That was unclear in the Ukrainian constitution. They've clarified that. They've taken away parliamentary immunity for MPs, and then done some things with land reform that are very positive. But he still has some tenuous connections to oligarchs in the country. He's got some interesting advisors on his team, people with a lot of experience, including his foreign minister, who's a career foreign servant. But the jury is still out. I think the biggest test hasn't really hit Ukraine yet. And I think there's cautious optimism still, and he still holds a lot of support from the Ukrainian public.
The U.S. commitment to Ukraine, how do you read that? Even in spite of what has gone on between Presidents Trump and Zelensky, the U.S. Congress has made multiple statements of strong support for Ukraine. Does Ukraine believe that U.S. support is both strong and stable?
I think those are two different questions. So I will lead by saying that the U.S. Congress support for Ukraine has always been bipartisan. That has always been heartening to me as a Ukraine watcher, as someone who spends a lot of time there, as someone who has Ukrainian blood. But I think the difference with this administration is that there is an incongruence between what has been U.S. policy in the past and what Congress continues to support, what the State Department has been pursuing in its foreign policy in Ukraine, and what the Trump administration says and does. And that is very confusing, not only for our allies in Ukraine, but for our other allies who are watching this scandal unfold around the rest of the world.
As I was anticipating interviewing you today about this topic, this is 24 hours after the Senate announced that there would be, or the House announced and the Senate, that there would be public proceedings on the impeachment beginning next Wednesday, a week from when we're recording. And I was trying to figure out, I guess the question is this: can U.S.-Ukrainian relations be reset in real time as this transpires, or does this really have to play out? Does U.S. domestic politics on the impeachment question have to play out before there is a reset of U.S.-Ukraine relations?
I think that's going to depend a lot on what happens in the impeachment inquiry. And I do think there is a distrust right now because it is
from the Ukrainian side.
Absolutely. And not to mention our other allies that, like I said, that are watching this unfold, because one thing that is extremely troubling to me reading these transcripts and having interacted with many of the diplomats who are up there testifying, these are career public servants who have given a lot, sacrificed a lot, and represent our country with the utmost integrity every day. These ambassadors and deputy ambassadors who are out there now, because of this shadow foreign policy that has been operating, hopefully only in Ukraine, but I am not sure that that's actually the case, their words and their integrity, their ability to do their job has been undermined. People are going to question from now on whether or not they represent the president. They are supposed to be serving at the pleasure of the president. Is what they say really representative of this administration? And I think that's going to be a big question. And until that is resolved in one way or another, I think it's going to be very difficult to do U.S. foreign policy in Ukraine and to build that relationship at what is a very critical time for Ukraine.
I know you've made the point that a lot of the Russian disinformation attempts or election meddling attempts were more or less beta tested in Ukraine before unleashed on the United States or other Western allies. It would seem like the U.S.-Ukrainian relation would be critical in managing that threat. Can we walk and chew gum at the same time? With all that's going on with our domestic politics and how it relates to Ukraine, are we able to be partners on working on disinformation?
I think so. There's a lot of good work that's happening in Ukraine, especially around cybersecurity. We've been helping them shore up their systems to Russian attacks. Certainly there are a lot of analysts and a lot of exchange of information that I'm part of that's going on. And we've still got a very good ambassador or charge d'affaires out there in Bill Taylor. So I have heart in the fact that these more mundane programs and areas of cooperation will continue. Whether they make their way up the chain is another question, but I certainly hope they do.
And maybe we'll visit that question on another day. But thank you now for, you bring such a multi-level perspective to these U.S.-Ukraine discussions.
Well, it's always a pleasure to join you, John.
Pleasure.
Thank you.
Hope you enjoyed as much as we did this edition of Wilson Center Now, and that you'll join us again soon. Until then, for all of us at the Wilson Center, I'm John Molesky. Thanks for joining us.